Good morning, Church at Odessa. It is a joy to be with you and any visitors who are watching all over via the World Wide Web. Thank you for choosing to get up this morning and listen to the Word as we study the Word. And today we are beginning a new series. We're still going to press pause on Romans 11. We're in Romans chapter 11. We're going to pause that until we can really all get back together and whenever or whatever that looks like. Right now, we want to still pause that. But I want to build on, begin this morning a new series that builds on our call over the last few weeks. And it really builds on even what we see in our world today, where many of us find ourselves today. And I want to begin this new study this morning for the next few weeks and really really endeavor to discover the beauty of lament and how it really informs not only how we live and how we view the world, but really also how we grieve. And that living and viewing the world and grieving, lament helps us take it to a point of hope, where it's not simply crying. You're not simply just resolved to walk through this world. You're doing what you're doing in hope. And I realize that on the surface, this is not the most appealing series. For one, nobody uses the word lament anymore, let's be honest. And number two, it would seem to be a downer. And if you listen to the songs that we write in Christendom and the series, it's all about getting us all hyped up. And the reality is enjoy, and that's fine. But the reality is, are we equipping believers to walk through real life? Because life hurts. And there are times where we are left with simply questions. And I spent this weekend in North Carolina with the Hampton family and was able to hopefully minister to many of Cade's friends and the extended family. And I spoke out of this. And, the beauty of this word, I would argue, is what believers need to see, especially today. We need to understand the beauty and wonder and grace of lament as we look at our world and as we face circumstances. And the evidence for this, let's be honest, unfortunately, it's all around us. We live in a broken world. We live in a world that is becoming more and more hostile to what I will call biblical Christianity. There's lots of forms of Christianity out there that the world is not hostile to because, quite frankly, they look too much like the world and they're not really Christianity. But biblical Christianity, standing up for the Word, standing on holiness, calling sin sin, mourning sin. Listen, the world is hostile to that. And the effects of sin are upon us, and let's be honest, they're all around us. If we were open and vulnerable, we looked at our lives honestly, the scars and the wounds and the hurts of sin are all throughout our lives, our relationships, personally, corporately, and these scars, this sin, this brokenness affects us not only individually, but corporately. And how we handle these things matter. How we walk through this personally and corporately, it matters. How we grieve matters. How we grieve says something about what we truly believe about God. In spite of what we might say, how we grieve says something. I think about 1 Thessalonians 4:13. It says, we do not grieve, believers, as do the rest of the world, as without hope. We grieve with hope. That hope tells something about what we believe. It says something about our God. It says something even about the gospel. And maybe that's why God dedicates an entire book of the 66 that are in the canon to the subject of lament, the book of Lamentations. 1/3 of all of the Psalms are lament psalms. And to us, if we're honest, it seems out of whack. We live in this prosperous, world where we have resources and we can deal with whatever we face and we're really not persecuted, let's say. And so to us, lament just seems out of whack. It just seems like overkill. And yet the reasons that this seems out of whack or seems irrelevant may tell more about us than we care to imagine. Let me ask you just some questions on the front end and just to see if we sense the real need for lament and why this may seem out of whack. Do you think we grieve sin as we should? Do you grieve sin as we should? Do we as a body, do we grieve in the right areas and the right amounts as we should? Are we grieving more because our bank accounts are low, or are we grieving more because people are dying and spending eternity apart from Christ? Even in the situation we're in now, are we grieving because of things that we can't do and maybe what this has cost us, or are we grieving that there are people perishing without the gospel, right? Do we love one another and long for one another to see the glory of God and to experience intimacy with Him as we ought, or do we help each other be distracted by worldly things? And are we okay with that? Do we feel out of place in this world, or maybe the issue is we feel too at home in this world? Do we love righteousness, and do we grieve unrighteousness as we ought? And I think as we dig down into those questions, we'll understand why or why not we're so unfamiliar or familiar with lament. God seems to have more to say to His people in their brokenness on this subject of lament than we know or even care to think about. Maybe even our sinfulness has dulled us to our own sinfulness and the beauty and the grace in lament. How do we even grieve sin? How do we grieve others' sin? Ponder that for a moment. Do we grieve over our sin and the effects of our sin? Do we grieve over others' sin? Or maybe sin has just become mistakes. Not sin. Not an offense to a holy God. An offense, by the way, that cost His Son His life. Sin. Do we grieve our sin? Do we see sin as rebellion against God that's worthy of death? As we gather as a body of Christ today, and as many of us listen on the internet, even though we are diverse geographically, we're diverse physically, we're diverse even socially, we share much in common where I believe lament will bless us. Learning to lament and a biblical understanding of lament will bless us, and I believe it will serve us well. Consider this. Every single one of us, whether you're listening live on Sunday morning or whether you're watching this on a video, consider, and you'll see these on your handout. If you don't have a handout, you can go to the Facebook website, download that handout, follow me, fill in the blanks. I'll try to make those very clear. But every single one of us share this in common. More than this, but this is at least what we share in common. Again, why lament? Let me tell you. You see an area in your handout. Our lives are full of painful moments. Painful moments. Our lives are full of them. Secondarily, our lives are marked by fear and struggles. If we're honest, our lives are marked by fear and struggles. Thirdly, see there, our lives are marked with a sense that things just aren't right. Things aren't right. Lastly, you'll see there, these painful moments have left us with questions. Questions. As you listen, as you sit here today, I promise you, we all have questions. At some point, something has or is or will happen in your life that will leave you completely undone. It will leave you questioning. It will leave you beyond yourself. You can't fix it. You can't solve it. You've got to walk through it. And the question is how. And when you're there, the question is going to become this. How do we voice these feelings and emotions and hurts and questions? And how do we walk through these in a way that points our heart to God, points others around us to God instead of away from God? That's lament. How do we walk through pain and questions and grief and sorrows? How do we walk through those in a way that leads others and ourselves to God rather than away from God? That's biblical lament. And I think as we consider all this here, we begin to see that lament is a very needed and a real dimension of the Christian life that I would argue many of us are missing. How do we grieve and hope? How do we voice our hurts and our questions and our feelings in a way that drives us to God and drives us to His grace versus pulls us away from His grace? The reality is all of us are hurt. All of us have hurts. All of us have questions. All of us are feeling things that we know aren't true, but we feel they're true. How do we, yet nobody wants to really talk about it. Nobody wants to get vulnerable about it. And yet when we do this, we miss great grace. And we miss what it means to lament. And here's what I mean by this. You'll see it on your handout. Lament leads us to the grace. The word there is grace. Lament leads us to the grace of God in a way that simply mourning or questioning or anger tends to lead us away from God. Lament leads us to God and to His grace in a fresh new way, whereas worldly sorrow and anger leads us away from God and His grace. When you and I will grasp lament over the next few weeks, we will see, hopefully, that we are free to ask, we are free to voice our anguish, we're free to voice our questions and our fears, but lament teaches us to do them rightly. Not in anger, but in lament, in hope. Listen, no matter what we face, no matter what you face, believer, you have no right to be angry at God. No matter what you face, you have no right to be angry at God. Confused, frustrated, overwhelmed, at a loss, feelings about Him right now that do not align with His character, that aren't confirmed in the Word, absolutely you can feel those, but not anger. And lament helps us avoid the danger and the pitfall of being angry at God and being stuck being angry at God. And if we're honest, these are places that we struggle. And very few are adept at not only voicing these things in the right way, but coming alongside others and allowing them to voice these things in a right way. We're not comfortable with lament. How do we do this? How do we feel these things and walk this road and still praise? How do we walk these roads and face these hurts and questions and all these things? How do we do them without filling our lives with these empty cliches that, quite frankly, don't work and do more damage than good? We've got all these cliches that mean nothing, that do nothing. How do we join in someone's grief in a way that leads to eventual worship and the glory of God? Not looking for that quick fix, but getting in the trenches with somebody, mourning with them, or even rejoicing with them. How do we give ourselves permission and others permission to wrestle with sorrow and questions, but not try to rush through it too quickly? That's the challenge. How do we learn the lesson? Because the difficulty is oftentimes we'll either stay there too long and become angry and depressed and be stuck there, or we'll rush through it way too quickly and not learn the lesson and not experience the grace of God. Listen to Psalm 13 for just a moment. Psalm 13, verses 1 through 6. How long, O Lord, will you forget me? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken. Here's the turn. But I have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. Here's a person who is in despair, who is overwhelmed, who feels like all of his enemies, everyone about him is winning. That's what he feels. And yet in verse 5, he turns to what he knows about God. In faith, in hope. He says, my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. Listen, there's a lot of things about our lives that have changed in our current circumstances. But there's so much that hasn't changed. God hasn't changed. His character hasn't changed. His promises haven't changed. The gospel hasn't changed. He says, verse 6, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Even in the midst of his despair, he recognized the grace of God. And so in that psalm, I read that because it's psalms like this, excuse me, that keep us out of the ditches on either side of grief and pain. Glossing over it too quickly is one ditch, but staying there or running from God altogether is the other ditch. And I think, again, these circumstances that we're in right now force us to face these very real questions and to deal with things. When we come out of these circumstances, our world may look vastly different. The world and the ways that you knew it may look very different. Listen, our church, the body of Christ, the church at Odessa may look vastly different. How do we grieve that? And the answer is lament. Knowing God is sovereign, yet admitting that we're hurting and that circumstances we're in do not seem good. How do we walk that road? The answer is lament. And that's the tension that we face every day. God is good, yet my circumstances don't seem good. How do we walk this road? And you see it on your handout. Lament is how we as believers walk between, you see the word between there, walk between the hardness of life and the sovereignty of God. Lament helps us bring our sorrows to God in a healthy way. It helps us to learn to process pain in a way that doesn't lead to silence or bitterness or anger or resentment towards God and toward others. How do we lament helps us to help others do the same. You see it there on your handout. Lament allows us and instructs us. The word there is instruct. It instructs us on how to hope in our hurt. And how do we stand firm in the Lord in the midst of it, just like we just saw in Psalm 13? Because listen, all of us can stand firm when there's no opposition, right? It's easy to profess undivided, uncompromising loyalty to God when there's no trouble, when there's no opposition, when the bank account is full, when you're healthy, when all your friends and loved ones are healthy, when everything's going the way you want it. But what about when trouble hits? What about when your child dies? What about when you lose your job and your finances go out of the window? When your rights are taken? When you feel like you're alone in this world, how will you respond then? Will you respond rightly or wrongly? In hope or without hope? Will you draw to the grace of God or will you run from the grace of God? Circumstances like these present us with the darkest clouds in life. And the question I have as the shepherd and the elders as our shepherds is this. Is the church at Odessa, are our members and visitors and those listening, are we ready for these times? How will we or how are we responding in these times? And I want, as a shepherd, and the elders want, as our shepherds, to help us be prepared to stand firm and to stand firm well. Not this stoic, false, just grin and bear it, but truly experiencing the grace of God no matter what we face. And on the front end, again, there's a lot. The first sermon in the series is always a little longer and more setting the stage, and part of that is a warning. This is going to be a heavy series, but I do believe it's going to be a fruitful and helpful series. And you may not sense that today or tomorrow or next week, but there may come a time in your life where you're brought to the end of yourself, and I pray that the Holy Spirit will bring to your mind the beauty of the Word, even the Word that we speak during this series, and help you come to the grace of lament and not anger and bitterness and resentfulness. And I want to say on the front end, much of this series has been gleaned from a book that I'm reading called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. I don't want more credit than I deserve. That book has just really, and that's the way my mind works. I'll read stuff and it'll trigger ideas and thoughts in my head, and then I'll run with them. And that book, great book, wonderfully helpful book. I was told about this book a few months ago and began reading it, and just God in His sovereign grace, I think, was preparing me not only for this past week, but also for just the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I'm learning, hear me, I'm learning with you. My heart is that this series will teach us not only the value of lament, but that we will learn to lament. More than simply crying when trials come, but rather in trials that we would grow closer to God through right mourning, through right lamenting, rather than simply crying. And you see on your handout, in lament, we learn to grow more like our God rather than to be drawn away from Him. We are conformed to Him rather than running from Him. That's the goal, to be drawn closer. And what I want to help us with is that when trials come, we will respond. We will be a people who respond in lament. Let it be lament, not anger. Anger leads us to distrust the Lord. Lament leads us to greater depths of mercy and grace and trust in the Lord, even if it's in faith that we trust, that we admit, I don't feel it now, I don't see it now, but God, I will trust that it will be one day. That's lament. And so turn with me to Psalm 77 as we begin our study today of lament. And I want to show us some things from this psalm, but really today I want to help us to further define and really have a clear definition. You'll see on your handout, what is lament? And as you're turning to Psalm 77, think about this. Think about this question. Who taught you to cry? The answer is nobody, right? I would bet for the most of us, we entered this world crying, right? We're sitting there as babies in the wonderful, the God-ordained, God-formed, warm, safe womb of our mothers. And then all of a sudden, we exit that into a cold, fearful place, and everything is out of whack. And what is our first response as we enter this world outside of our mother's womb? It's to cry. That to cry is human. Our lives begin with crying, and the reality is many of our lives will end in crying, either ourselves or our loved ones or both. Crying is human, and for most people, this is how they think, this is how they think they show grief, or this is what they think of when they think of grief. And to be sure, God offers the gift of crying. Jesus Himself wept at Lazarus' tomb in John 11:35, but that was not simply crying. If you look at the word there, Jesus was mourning, He was grieving strongly the effects of sin. It went beyond mere tears. It transports us, lament and real mourning, into the depths of the grace of God. And so for a definition, as we work through this, you'll see it on your handout, definition of lament. Lament is a prayer in pain that leads to greater, the word there is greater. Lament is a prayer in pain that leads to greater trust in God and therefore hope no matter what we face. Lament, if you don't come out with a greater trust in God, then you did not lament. Hear me. You may have mourned. You may have cried. But you didn't lament. Because hear me. What I want us to see is this. Lament is an expression of what we believe about God. And lament itself is fueled by a belief in God. His redemption, His sovereignty, they're there. We know this and thus we hope. But lament admits that at the moment, we do not sense them. But lament transports us to the fact that we know they're there. And how we express this tension is lament. It is theology expressed in our mourning. That's lament. Lament takes us closer to God. Listen, if that doesn't happen, again, your mourning probably wasn't lament. Lament produces hope. Lament fuels hope. Lament fuels standing firm. Lament is the very hope that we have in God's deliverance and a conviction that we have that He is indeed what the Word says that He is. If that were not so, even as believers, we would be stuck at merely crying, right? If there were no hope in God, if there was no hope in the sovereignty of God, that His loving kindnesses didn't cease, then we could only merely cry, for there is no hope. There's no really reason even to complain, right? Because why continue to question, why continue to hurt or complain if the verdict has already been decided or if God doesn't care or can't do anything about it? Lament transports us to a place of hope. And you see it on your handout, lament is rooted. It's rooted in what we believe about God even when we might not presently feel it. See this. This is what we're saying here. And I challenge us that the Word challenges us to lament. To trust even when you do not feel it. And lament itself, again, is birthed out of the very trust that God is indeed who the Word says that He is, even when you don't feel it. And therefore, we can bring our hurts and questions and griefs to the Lord and know that He's capable and that He hears us. And this ultimately will provide hope. Lament declares that we agree that this world is broken, but at the same time that God is powerful and that He will always be faithful. Lament stands in the gap between, again, a sovereign God and a broken world that we'd find ourselves in. And throughout the Psalms, you see the psalmists asking basically two questions. Even the writer of Lamentations, two questions. And these two questions have been asked by every single person within the sound of my voice. I would think that it would be 100% true. That these two questions, every believer, every person has probably asked at some point in their life. You see on my handout. First question, in the midst of trials, where are you, God, in all of this? Where are you, God? Second question, if you loved me, why is this happening? And these questions on the surface can seem out of place for the believer. Oftentimes as believers, someone will ask these questions and we get all weirded out in that. We're like, oh, can they ask? And yet, actually, here's the point. If we really understood lament, if we really understood hope, if we really understood these things, we would understand that these questions, when handled rightly, are actually paths to praise in the midst of our brokenness. Because if we ask honest questions to God, we're going to get honest answers. And the reality is God was the same place in your hurt that He was as He watched His Son die on a cross. He was there. He knew all about it, and He was sovereign over it. And the reality is, in the midst of your hurt, He does love you. And if we are bold enough to ask those questions in the right spirit, we're going to get good answers, and we're going to have hope. Because God's going to answer the questions. That's why I say it's actually a path to praise. You see it on a handout. Lament bridges. The word is bridges. Lament bridges the place of brokenness where we stand today to that place of praise where we will hopefully stand tomorrow or one day. It's a transition between pain and promise. Psalm 103:2 says, do not forget the Lord and none of His benefits. That's what Satan wants in the midst of trials, in the midst of struggles, that you forget that God is still ever present with you and that God still loves you. His mercies, His loving kindnesses have never ceased. And lament is the pathway from where we are today to the hope of tomorrow. It helps us to get from the rubble of today to the Redeemer of every hurt that we will ever face in this world. He's redeemed. And so look with me at Psalm 77. That's the intro. Psalm 77. A couple truths I think that'll help us as we walk away from here today as we begin to look at lament. As we walk this road and as we face hurt and desperation and such. You'll see them on your handout. Number one, in our time of despair and unknowing, keep praying. Keep praying. Look with me at Psalm 77, verses 1 and 2. My voice rises to God, and I will cry aloud. My voice rises to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. In the night my hand was stretched out without weariness. What we see here is that this is a psalm that is dealing with comfort in the midst of trouble. And what the psalmist, Asaph, in this situation, he's the writer here, he is recalling God's mighty deeds in the midst of trouble. And what we see here immediately is a direct connection between lament and turning to God. Lament ought to drive us to God. Worldly sorrow drives us away from God. Lament keeps pushing us towards God in our pain. The psalmist is in experiencing trouble. And in the midst of his trouble, he kept praying. He kept seeking the Lord. Satan would love for you and your sorrow and your pain and your tragedy, he would love for you to be driven away from God. For that to drive you away from your Redeemer. And in the midst of the pain, God is rather inviting you closer. And lament encourages, it invites us to be honest with our struggles, to be honest with our deep pain, to be honest with our tough questions, but yet be girded and undergirded and stand firm in trust. Stand firm that the Bible is still true. To be steadfast and immovable, as we saw in 1 Corinthians 15:58. That we have a faith in a God who is sovereign and good no matter what. That we know that greater is He who is in us than he who is in the world. All those promises God has given us. That's why the psalmist again in 103:2 says, do not forget the Lord and none of His benefits. And in the midst of our pain, in the midst of our sorrow, in the midst of our hurt, that's exactly what we're prone to forget. And what the psalmist is saying, what he's teaching us, is in the midst of these trials and struggles, keep talking to God. Lament is that invitation to turn to God in the midst of our pain, and that takes faith. It takes faith to trust what you do not presently feel. And lament is so much more productive and better than silence, though silence is oftentimes where we run. And what, especially towards God, and what the psalmist is telling us here is, and what lament reminds us is that there's no silent treatment here. Turn to God in your pain. Keep turning to God in your pain. And if I can challenge with us something this morning to ponder, you'll see it on your handout. Responding to God in the midst of pain and hurt with the silent treatment could be ultimately an expression of disbelief. Think about that. The silent treatment towards God might just indeed be an expression of disbelief. Despair lives under the belief that God doesn't care, that He doesn't hear, that He can't do anything about your situation. Again, go back to the two questions we said we all asked. We ask them, but know that there are good answers for those. And the answer is that God is ever present and God's loving kindnesses never cease. You'll discover that if you walk through lament. And I wonder today how many believers stop talking to God in the midst of their pain. Listen, we're really good at talking to other people when we ought to be talking to God. And how many believers wound up in a spiritual desert because they gave God the silent treatment and turned away from the Bible, turned away from prayer? Silence, wrong silence is a killer to the soul. The psalmist here is in pain. You and I may be in pain. Be honest, but don't be silent. Reach out to God in our pain. Listen, He can handle it. He wants to handle it. And even that takes faith to reach out in pain. Getting beyond how we feel to what we know. Remembering what we know to be true of God, even when it's messy. Turning to God. Listen, turning to God in the midst of our hurts and our pains, that may be the deepest expression of faith that we'll have, is to turn to God, especially when we don't feel it and we feel like everything around us says not to do that. Because nothing about us sometimes tells us, everything about us says, do not turn to God, it's useless, and yet you turn to God. In the midst of your despair and knowing, keep praying. Secondly, in the midst of our time and our unknowing. Pray your struggles. Pray your struggles. Look at verses 2 through 4. We read verse 2. Look at 3 through 4. When I remember God, then I am disturbed. When I sigh, then my spirit grows faint. You have held my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. There will be times when we feel that prayer isn't working. I would bet that we've all been there. And what the psalmist says is, even when you feel that prayer isn't working, keep praying and admit that you're struggling. Oftentimes, to our circumstances, there are no immediate solutions. There are no timely answers. But here it is, you see in your handout. We must keep believing that one day God will answer and do what He has promised. One day. Pray your struggles. Keep praying. Thirdly, in our time of despair and unknowing, pray your questions. Look at verses 5 and 6. I have considered the days of old, the years of long ago. I will remember my song in the night. I will meditate with my heart, and my spirit ponders. Listen, the psalmist had questions. You keep reading on to verse 7. Will the Lord reject forever? Will He never be favorable again? Has His loving kindnesses ceased forever? Has His promises come to an end forever? Has God forgotten to be gracious, or has His anger withdrawn His compassion? Then I said, is my grief that the right hand of the God of the Most High has changed? Listen, there are 6 questions you see here in this section, namely verse 7. 6 questions in this psalm that all of us have or may be asking today, and I put them on the handout there for you. They go something like this. If you looked at verse 7, here they go. First question, will the Lord reject us forever? There may be a circumstance in your life where you feel like the Lord has rejected and is seemingly rejecting you forever. Second question, will the Lord be favorable again? Will the Lord ever be favorable to me again? Third, has His steadfast love ceased? You may be in a circumstance where you feel that. Are His promises still sure? Fifthly, is God still gracious? Sixth, is God angry with me? The psalmist asks all 6 of those questions in his grief. But listen, not for 1 second does he believe them deep down. He asks them, he feels them. And that's the challenge. Don't be afraid to ask, but don't dwell. The emotions are real, but the emotions and feelings may not be true. No one is arguing that you don't feel that, but what we're saying is just because you feel it doesn't make it true. It's his grief, right? Grief is telling you these things, and they're not true. But don't be afraid to admit that you're struggling. That's lament. You can do that in lament. Pray your questions. Pray your struggles. Fourthly, in our time of despair and unknowing, pray that prayer will turn things around. Look at verses 11 through 15. I shall remember. There it is. I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. This goes back, Psalm 103. Do not forget the Lord and none of His benefits. Your ways, O God, is holy. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your strength among the peoples. You have by your power redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Verses 1 through 10, pain and grief. Verses 11 through the end, hope. Recalling to his mind the certainty and the surety of God and His character, even His own deliverance. And you see on your handout, the key word in transition here is remembering the character and the works of the Lord. Remember. It makes me think about Lamentations chapter 3. In Lamentations chapter 3, verses 19 and following, listen to what it says. The writer says here, remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. All right? Grief. And yet here's the hope. This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. He turns away from his grief to the certainty and the surety of the character of God. Listen what he says. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. Jeremiah here in Lamentations is saying exactly what the psalmist Asaph says in Psalm 77. Keep praying, keep remembering. In Psalm 73, we see the same thing. He's lamenting. It's sorrow. The wicked seem to be prospering. And then verse 17, until I came into the sanctuary of God, then I perceived their end. He remembered. What binds all these passages together is remembering. Getting our minds fixed back on the character, the certain character and surety of God. And lament helps remind us of God and his goodness and his character and his love, and that these never cease. Even now, even tomorrow, the next day. You see it on your handout. In all of our questions, in all of our sorrow, in all of our struggles, and lament does this where anger will not, we must get to the place where we recall to our minds what we know to be true about God. That's why I said you can't dwell in your questions. There's answers. There's answers to all of those questions. And this is where the Word comes in, knowing the Word and reading the Word and being so saturated in our minds, full of the Word and His promises overflowing. Romans 15:4, for whatever was written in earlier times, Romans 15:4, whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. When we neglect the Word, when we neglect the Scriptures, we're ruining our hope. We're attacking our own hope. Because that's what we're going to recall to our mind in the midst of the struggles and the trials. We're going to know the character of God and its certainty and its surety, and we'll have hope. We'll recall to our mind Psalm 77:13. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is there like our God? Isaiah, whatever it is, 40, I think it's Isaiah 40. That's the whole purpose, is the greatness of God. And all 6 of the questions that he asked in verse 7 are answered in verses 11 through 15 by focusing on God's character that he knows to be true. What the psalmist is saying and what he's teaching us about lament is that lament turns our honest questions into confident trust. Lament does that. It helps us to believe that and reminds us that God is true and that he is good. You'll see it in your handout. Lament helps us make the shift from what we feel to be true to what we know to be true. Lament is how we learn to live between the hard circumstances of today and the goodness of God. Circumstances often create tension between what we feel is true and what we know to be true. Tension between God's sovereignty and his goodness and his grace and his love, and yet where we are is hard, and we must be disciplined to remind ourselves. And even this is a part of why we gather. See Hebrews 10, reminding ourselves that God is faithful, he is good, his loving kindnesses indeed never cease. On and on it goes. And God gives us, in the Bible, God gives us the permission to grieve. It is normal, but he calls us to lament, not just cry. Because lament directs us to what is true about God. Lastly, in our time of despair and unknowing, here it goes, pray the gospel. And in doing so, you remind yourself of the gospel. Look at verses 16 through 20. The waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you, they were in anguish. The deeps also trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth a sound, your arrows flashed here and there. The sound of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was in the sea, and your paths in the mighty waters, and your footprints may not be known. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. What is he talking about there? He's reminding them of the Exodus. The Exodus. And the Exodus was that moment in Israel's history of God delivering them from Egyptian slavery. It was a picture of salvation, if you will. And the psalmist anchors his lament here in God's salvation, in God's redemption. Listen, for you and me, believer, today, our Exodus event is the cross. It's the cross. A picture of ultimate deliverance. Your lament, your anguish, your sorrow has got to take you to the cross. You see it in your handout. The cross is the place where all of the believers' heartaches and pains should be taken, because it reminds us that God has already proven himself to be for us, not against us. The cross. Interestingly enough, we just got finished with Romans 8, where Paul talks about all these precious and beautiful promises. In the midst of Romans 8, Paul quotes Psalm 44 when he says, like a lamb, we are all led to the slaughter every day. It's in those moments we need to be reminded that God's for us, not against us, that nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus, not even death. God's promises do not mean, the salvation, the gospel do not mean that we will not face trials, but in the midst of the trials, it means that we cannot be separated from God. And this is where this grounds us. You see it in your handout. In redemption, Jesus bought the right to make everything right. Even if we're killed all day long, as Paul says in Romans 8, as he quotes Psalm 44, God will make it right. Because it can't separate us from the love of God. The reality is it only ushers us into the presence of God, even if someone kills us. Right? And that's where Paul says in Romans 8:37, in this we overwhelmingly conquer. I hope we see here uniquely how unique Christian lament is. How it actually ushers us into God's grace rather than robbing us of grace. Reminding us of God and his promises in the midst of our questions and our circumstances that say otherwise. You see on your handout as we close here, to cry is human, but to lament is Christian. Hear me. To lament is Christian. And here's what I mean by this as we close. Some practical takeaways. Every lament is a prayer. It's a prayer. Every lament is a statement of faith. It's a statement of faith. Lament is how a Christian wrestles with the paradox of pain and the promises of God. That's how we wrestle. Lament. Keep praying. Keep struggling. Keep wrestling. Keep talking to God. This is how we journey through life's hardships and God's goodness. May we as a people learn to do this. May we learn to help each other do this, all to the glory of God, and may we experience greater grace in this. Lord, help us to be a lamenting people. Help us to understand life is hard and yet you remain good. And your grace is sufficient. Your character doesn't change. Your promises do not change. Help us to be drawn together as a body, not only to you but to one another as we learn to lament. As we encourage one another and help each other to walk faithfully through these trials. Help us to be a lamenting people. And in doing so, be a gracious people, a righteous people, and a God-honoring people. And we ask this in the precious name of Christ. Amen. Love you guys. Grateful to be your pastor.